For me, as a Swiss Rail Managing Director, it's a little bit the start up or a kickoff, I hope, for a good cooperation in Australia for our members, because there are a couple of good projects coming up. I think there is really now the market growth visible. And we have next year planned, of course, to have the exhibition. I mean, I think we will have this in December or November, and I think it's important that we also then probably from Swiss Rail, if we have enough interest to be there present. Of course, some companies are always present, but Ausrail is a good event as it is quite far away, of course. We will also, for the information, do some kind of export workshops in the future, because we see as well some synergies of representing companies in Australia for Swiss technology and Swiss Rail members. We will also address that in the next upcoming months, because we see, of course, Australia for as well companies not yet really active in this market to be more successful in Australia. And to be from Swiss Rail, we coordinate that together with Swiss Global Enterprise, and there's a long way to go. Let's take it from there. Thank you very much again for everybody participating. I think we have a huge interest. I think we have almost 40 people and 40 interest companies from Swiss Rail in the call, in the webinar. Yeah, Marsha, I would hand over to you. Thank you and enjoy it. Have a good morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Andy, and a warm welcome from Australia also. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to the webinar, because I think I can only echo to say that there are a lot of opportunities here. So I look forward to presenting these together with the companies that are on the call. And maybe just for a bit of housekeeping, if you've got any questions, you can put them in the chat, or at the end we're going to have a Q&A. If we feel that the connection isn't too good, maybe people who aren't speaking can take off their cameras. It just helps a little bit if there's any problems with the connection. So as Andy said, my name is Marsha Buzzolini. I head up the trade section, or the so-called TradePoint Australia, or abbreviated TPAU in some of the slides, on behalf of Switzerland Global Enterprise. Our offices are located within the Consulate General of Switzerland in Sydney, and our speakers are also based in Sydney. And it's actually not afternoon here, Andy, it is nighttime here already. It's a 10-hour time difference at the moment. So I really want to acknowledge the speakers that are here from Australia. Just really much appreciated that you're taking your evening time with your families to speak on this call. Just for me to start sharing quickly. I hope this works. If you can't see it, just give me a shout out. So as I said, a warm welcome. And just in terms of the agenda, so I'll chat for about 10 minutes, just giving you an introduction and an overview of the Australian market and also of Switzerland Global Enterprise, because there are companies here that have not worked previously with Switzerland Global Enterprise. Then Phil Hare from Strategy Australia will be speaking about the business opportunities that we've identified and also put in the report that Andy mentioned earlier. That report was also written with Bob Eggleton, who might unmute himself for some of the questions. Then we have Sonia Karayan from Emken Berger, or from Binary Consulting here in Australia, to give an overview. And she is accompanied on the call by Felix, also from Emken Berger, Felix Laube. Then Steve Johnson will be speaking on behalf of Matisa, of their experiences here in Australia. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end and a conclusion. So just before I give you an overview of the Australian rail sector, just quickly, as I mentioned, want to talk about Switzerland Global Enterprise. So Switzerland Global Enterprise is the official Swiss consultancy for export and investment promotion. There's about 200 employees throughout Switzerland and in 31 countries. And in Switzerland, the offices are in Zurich, in Renan, near Lausanne, and in Lugano. And all of those offices are happy to speak with any of you if you need further information. The external or the global network of Switzerland Global Enterprise is made up of 22 Swiss business hubs and 4 trade points. And these offices are embedded within the embassies or the consulate generals in the different locations. So in Australia, it's in Sydney, obviously, a big city with trade. The capital city, Canberra, is more of a political hub, as I'm sure some of the Australians on the call here can attest to. So it made more sense to have it in the consulate general. In addition to this global network, and I think that's also an important point, all of the Swiss business hubs have a network, an additional network, I guess, that we work with, and it's important to point that out as well. So this is what we call, I guess, the Team Australia, because it takes a big village to, to be able to do it all together. In terms of Switzerland Global Enterprise, I just want to give this quick overview of the services that are offered. So that can be anything really. It can start from customs forms and export documentation over biosecurity matters, which are really important here in Australia, as you'll come to know. If you deal with this market, market analysis, legal clarifications, business partner searches, we can assist with trade fairs. That was mentioned also by Andy for the Austrade fair, for example. Business delegations, the world is your oyster. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us in Switzerland or in Australia. Before I completely dive into the rail sector, I just want to reiterate the size of this country. Some of you have already been here, some have travelled here privately, but people do forget the size of Australia sometimes. And I think, sort of reiterating that it's the 6th largest country in the world, and Switzerland fits into Australia 186 times is also important. So if you look at the map there, the bottom right-hand corner where you have Tasmania, Switzerland is smaller than Tasmania. So it really is a large landmass. And the rail system, as you'll see in a slide later on from one of the presenters, there's rail tracks going across very vast areas of this country. Now, just in terms of rail, the projects that we'll mainly be talking about with Phil and possibly Bob are along that east coast of Australia. So where it says Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, so the states of Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. Those are really the areas where there's the densest population in Australia, and also where some of these bigger projects that we've looked at are located, but that doesn't say that there's not other projects in other places. So we just selected. We have a new federal government. So we used to have a Liberal government. Now we have a Labor government. The Prime Minister is Anthony Albanese. And interestingly, just last week, there was a federal budget release in Australia. And I just wanted to bring this up because I think it's important because some sectors weren't so lucky with the budget. They lost out, but the rail sector is really a clear winner in terms of the budget because the importance of the rail sector has been recognised in Australia. So this is going to sound maybe a little bit complicated, but there was $14.2 million that were allocated to a national rail manufacturing plan. And as part of that, there will be the establishment of an Office of National Rail Industry Coordination, which is ONRIC. And that in turn will be charged with developing a national rail procurement and manufacturing strategy. Now, it sounds a bit complex and it's certainly a mouthful to say, but I guess what it really means, it's finally addressing a problem that we've had, or a concern for a long time in Australia. Swiss companies might expect that Australia has a national rail approach, but truth be told, it hasn't. It's very fragmented. It's very state-based, which, you will notice when you get into the whole track system. So there's about 33,000 kilometres of track and 3 different gauge systems in Australia. And the creation of this national rail procurement and manufacturing strategy will really go a long way to address something that the Australian Railway Association, the ARA, which is pretty much the equivalent of Swiss Rail for Australia, they've really been lobbying government and advocating for a long time for this national approach. So we're heading in the right direction. Some of the funding from the budget would also go to Rail Industry Innovation Council, and that will address research, skills and capacities alongside a 15 billion Australian dollar over the next 7 years for a national reconstruction fund to support and transform Australian industry in general. So one of the things I guess Australia hasn't done very well is look at the skills. So we can't have a strategy and not look at the skills. And there also the government luckily has has recognised this past era, I guess, and I'm sure that Matisa will say something to that. It has been very difficult for companies here to find the right labour. So the government has finally released, as part of the budget, $921 million, Australian dollars, obviously, when I say dollars all the time. It's over the next 5 years to really support Australia's vocational education and training system. So what the Swiss do exceptionally well in terms of vocational training, the Australians are lagging behind, but can certainly learn a lot from the Swiss companies. And just as an aside, which doesn't really go in the whole rail sector, but it also helps, Switzerland and Australia actually signed an agreement for a working holiday visa, which commenced at the beginning of this year, and that's been lobbied for a very long time. So there has been a visa before for the under 30s, but now, young people that are, coming out of these vocational courses and want to come to Australia actually have this possibility, which I think will be really beneficial for Swiss companies that are already established here or the ones that want to come. And there's also a new category for highly skilled people for permanent residency visas that is being funded. So that is a good thing to address these problems I mentioned earlier. Just to finally just get back to the budget figures, I guess what it really expresses is the importance of rail with all the money that's being thrown at it. We've got a huge mining industry, as most people probably know. We don't have the best reputation in terms of decarbonisation. That is changing quite drastically and quite quickly now, though. There's a lot of money being thrown at renewable energy and the renewable sector in general. But importantly, and I think, it's not highlighted enough, how many critical minerals need to be extracted for the renewable sector to actually function. So one of the things that rail can help with, obviously, is transporting these critical minerals to ports, because a lot of countries are requiring these, not just in Australia. The other sector that is having lots and lots of money thrown at it is the hydrogen sector. And again, hydrogen needs to be transported. What is the best way? Probably rail. So it's been a real wake-up call, I think, for the federal government and also the state governments to look more into the sustainability of things, the whole decarbonisation and the role of rail in that whole process. And maybe just one thing, maybe as I've been speaking, you've looked at some of the announcements here out of the budget, but the one that's on the right-hand side, it's a $500 million budget that has been allocated for the acquisition and planning for a fast rail. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen very, very quickly, but at least the planning is there. It's the first time Australia is looking at that. So I think it's really important development as well in terms of developing fast rail projects. Then Australia's cities, they're growing. The population is growing. The cost of living pressures are huge, as they are in many other places. And Switzerland really has some excellent companies, I think, that can, help address some of the issues that we have and help address the problems we have in the rail sector and compete or work with Australian companies for some of these projects. So I'd like to hand over to Phil now. I'll just have to see how I can click out of this. I think I can do it so that Phil can share his screen. So Phil is from Strategy Australia, and then the two companies will speak about their experiences here. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Marsha, for that comprehensive overview there. So I'll just get into some of the key business opportunities that we've found and how we believe or what the attractiveness is of each of the various categories. So just before we do that, I'll sort of just give you an overview of the agenda that we'll just quickly go through, I guess within about the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. But again, as Marsha alluded to, there's opportunities at the end of this to ask various questions about what you're seeing during the webinar. So initially, I guess we found it important just to sort of very briefly overview the methodology that we used for this particular project. Pretty stock standard sort of stuff. We broke it into 3 stages. First of all was the analysis of Swiss companies in terms of descriptions, more accurate descriptions of what they actually offer. So we use that as a basis then for, you know, reconciling what we found in the Australian market. Stage 2 was very much hands-on, a practical stage where we undertook the market analyses. We looked at various products and technologies, as I said, that were used, you know, potentially used now or needed now and in the future. And we also undertook some selective interviews that you can see here, and that'll come out in the reports and some of the other slides you see as we get through this presentation. And stage 3 was just simply about reconciling all of that data to create useful information on which perhaps actions can be, you know, taken to start to participate in the Australian market. So that was just a very simple methodology we used. If we go on to the next slide, we're looking here basically at just some of the key, I guess, characteristics of the Australian market. So you can see here that when we're looking at track and putting it into some sort of comparison with the rest of the world, you know, we're looking at approximately 33 kilometers of track in Australia. So that makes it about, well, in fact, about the 6th largest in the world. So key in terms of, you know, a market that should be focused on in the future. And as a consequence, there are many opportunities. Similarly, if we sort of extend that a bit further, Australia also has one of the largest private railway networks in the world. And I guess that's concentrated, as again, as Marsha alluded to, in our very huge mining sector. So again, in the report, there's some specific information about our private rail network networks and who operates them, and the areas that they service and the opportunities within the private network sector. You can see over here that approximately in the Australian rail construction pipeline, we're looking at about $150 billion currently. That's seen sort of projects that may increase over the next future terms, but we're looking at opportunities for the next 15 plus years in passenger and freight rail. So clearly, it's not a once-off type of opportunity that they were offering in Australia. It's a sustainable business opportunity. If we look again at some sort of comparison figures here to give you something to compare in your own markets, Australia spends, and I don't know why this is in US dollars, everything else is in Australian dollars, but approximately $26,500 spend per kilometre of railway track in Australia over that 33,000 kilometre network. So again, quite a significant spend per kilometre. And I guess the final key point on this particular slide is the policy that we have specifically in the transport sector. And we'll talk about that a bit later on in a couple of slides we'll go to. But we're looking at some of the driving features of the market is that we're working towards carbon neutrality by 2050. So again, there's more information on that in the report, which we'll talk about at the end. Now, okay. So how did we do this particular project? Well, we had to break it up into categories because there's so many vast sort of technologies, products, services in use in a very large sector that we have in Australia. So Bob and I analysed a number of global reports, industry reports, and we found that mostly the industries or the segments or categories could be categorized broadly into these four categories. So we've got rail and rolling stock, digital technologies, engineering services, I mean professional services such as consultancy, planning, project management, that sort of stuff. And then this over here, which we also think is very key, energy and propulsion, especially with Australia's focus on renewable energies and just that general sensitivity around carbon emissions. So that sort of sets the scene for the rest of the, the few slides that are coming in terms of what the various categories are as a basis on which to understand, what the specific technologies and products are that are opportunities in these particular areas. So if we move on to the next slide, I just want to take each one of these categories in isolation. But before I do that, I just want to explain over here, if we look at this particular indicator here, this is not a scientific indicator by any means. It's purely based on anecdotal evidence that Bob and I found in undertaking the projects and analysing a whole range of various characteristics of the market. So I just want to emphasize, it's not scientific, it's not data driven, it's purely anecdotal evidence that we've put together as a broad indicator of the category attractiveness for future business. So if we look at the rail and rolling stock first, there are, I guess you can see from the indicator here that we've marked this. I guess we've marked this down in terms of category attractiveness purely because it's the most mature when we compare it to digital engineering services and energy and propulsion. That is not to say that there are limited opportunities there. It's purely based on it is a much more mature, operation or category. So you can see here, these are the types of products and technologies that will be required in the future. So carriages, obviously, couplings, bogies, locomotives, braking systems, advanced manufacturing and advanced materials in particular. I guess some of the drivers there are really improved maintenance sort of costs and control over what happens in the asset life and increased passenger comfort. So those two key factors are components of some of the driving factors that's in the rail and rolling stock. Digital technologies, well, you can see how we've marked that up here. A very what we call, I guess, an early growth or emerging. We know it's there. We know it's concrete, but it's still not embryonic, but early growth in terms of the adoption by rail authorities across Australia. So we see that as a potential very significant area for future growth. And we see that, not surprisingly, and Sonia will talk more in detail about this, but signaling monitoring systems, condition assessments, asset management type material with solutions with sensors, live sensors, TMS, again, which Sonia will speak about. Data standardization, that is key because I guess as an example of that, currently there's around 11 different signaling and train management systems operating across Australia, 11. So you can understand the push to get some form of standardization across that particular sector with digital technologies. If we look very briefly at engineering services as a broad category, I guess that's been driven by Australia's very acute shortage of skilled and unskilled resources, to be honest. And I think that there is, from what we've seen, there looks like to be a peak demand that's about 48% greater than supply. So that gap becomes very apparent in terms of the opportunity for Swiss-based companies in consultancy services, planning services, and project management. So again, there's more information about that in the report, and we go into some more detail. If we look at the final one here, you can see we've marked this reasonably high again in terms of sector attractiveness. So you can see energy and propulsion here. One of the main things that's driving energy consumption here, or reductions in emissions, is that the transport sector currently accounts for around about 18% of Australia's total current CO2 emissions. Now, of that 18%, roughly 85% of that is attributable to road transport, compared to only 4% for rail. So this is driving a focus, a government-driven focus, on achieving a modal shift of transport from road to rail. And you can see that some of the opportunities there for this decarbonisation are clean diesels, highly refined diesels, blends of diesel, so to remove the sulfur content, blended diesels, fuel cells, energy storage systems, which isn't just an issue in rail, but in Australia, it's a significant issue across all energy sectors where we need greater storage systems, greater efficient systems, and of course, next generation electric motors, which we have a significant rail stock here. So next generation electric motors could be retrofitted to the existing stock. So we see that as a tremendous opportunity for more efficient and electric motors. So that's sort of a bit of a summary and a bit of a snapshot about where we believe by category that the opportunities are. So what are, I guess, the next steps in terms of what Swiss companies can do? Well, again, as Marcia said, there's a detailed report available, and that will be published on the Go Global website. That is, you can access that to download it. TPAU and SGE can provide much more assistance, practical assistance to Swiss companies that may be interested in exploring the opportunities, the business opportunities in Australia more. And some of those services, these are just examples, there's many more, but certainly the optimum market entry strategy that could be deployed or utilised by Swiss companies to, I guess, accelerate their establishment here. Distributor identification and engagement, and again, we touch on that in the report if you would like to download that. On the ground assistance with business setups and so on, which is a key to really starting business in Australia. And of course, last but not least, business introductions to some of the key organisations that perhaps can catalyse more action and start the flow rolling of business or transactions between Swiss rail businesses in Switzerland and the key Australian players here. So all of that information is available from Marcia here from TPAU, and of course Swiss Global Enterprise, where I've said before, it is now published on the website and it's there for downloading. So thank you for your attention in this very brief overview of some of the business opportunities in Australia in the rail sector. And I'll now hand over back to Marcia.
Thank you very much for that overview, Phil. And now we would like to hear from Sonia, if you would like to unmute and put your camera on so that you can give us an overview of your sector and the signalling.
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone. I hope my presentation is coming through to you. I'll just put it in presenter mode. Does that look okay, Masha?
Yep, that looks fine.
I'll get rid of that one. Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia Carrion. I'm here representing Binary Consultants, which is a subsidiary of a Swiss company, M. Berger, based in Bern. My colleague, Felix Laube, is also coming in and out of the meeting as well, and hopefully he'll be here for the questions at the end. So just to get started, an overview of what I'm going to take you through, a little bit about the background of the company and myself as well, why we chose Australia as our home away from home somehow, and the opportunities and challenges that we've experienced over here in the last couple of years. So just to get started, a bit of the background of Binary Consultants. So as I mentioned, the parent company of Binary is M. Berger, based in Bern. I worked for M. Berger for about 6 years, based in Denmark, and so that's where the connection comes in. We had a lot of different clients that we worked with, from Network Rail, SBB, Deutsche Bahn, Norwegian, Finnish, Danish projects, and also with Transport for New South Wales, the state here that Sydney is in. And Binary then is, as I mentioned, the subsidiary. We have very close collaboration ongoing with M. Berger and the team there and the team here. And we share some clients as well. So Binary is also connected to Banedanmark and Transport for New South Wales, Network Rail, SBB, and then additionally to Queensland Rail, which is the state up north from New South Wales that has Brisbane as its capital. So that's just a bit of the background of how the companies are structured. About myself, as I mentioned, I am actually Australian, based here in Sydney. We moved over here when I was 13. So that's obviously a bit of a preview as to why we chose Australia as the home away from home. But I spent 6 years with M. Berger, based in Denmark, and Banedanmark Signaling Program. So 3 years as their process test manager. So working with Banedanmark and basically process testing the systems to make sure that they could be used in the way that Banedanmark wanted to use them. And because we found a lot of issues with that, I eventually moved more towards the design side of TMS and looking at the design of that to support the business processes of Banedanmark. And then basically, when COVID hit and the world became very big, I decided that I would like to be back here, closer to my family and my friends. So then I moved back here at the end of 2020, and we started up Binary Consultants. So it was actually purchased as an existing company that was established back in 1999, and I took over as managing director. And so far, we have worked primarily here in Australia, in addition to some of that other work, with Queensland Rail, where they're conducting a big project called Cross River Rail. And I'll explain a little bit about some of those opportunities later. And there I was the TMS engineering lead for all of last year. And this year I've worked in Transport for New South Wales and Sydney Trains digital systems program. So in this project, I'm currently the TMS project engineer. So just a bit of a background there. Why we chose Australia, obviously it was triggered by me deciding I'd like to be a bit closer to home, but that wasn't the be all and end all of it. The conditions also had to be right for starting up some business here. And basically there were 4 factors we looked at in making the decision to purchase this subsidiary company and start up our own operation. The first was that we felt the market was really mature for the services we want to provide, and I'll go into a bit of detail about those services later. But basically, there's a big railway project boom taking place right the way across Australia. There's been a big, particularly in the public systems, a lot of lack of funding and investment in the infrastructure over the last couple of decades, and finally, there's been, I think, as Masha mentioned early on, a big, even up at the federal government level, decision to change that and to start really investing in some of these projects, and particularly projects based on contemporary rail IT. So a lot of the states now have their own explicit digitalization strategies for the public transport sector. So how they want to do these revamps based on digital systems and use that to improve the services that they provide. And ETCS is obviously one of those main and very well known digital systems now. It's being rolled out in New South Wales and Queensland, so Sydney and Brisbane states so far, but I know there are plans in other states as well to start up those sorts of projects. So that was the first point, a mature market here for our services and digitalization projects. And then what was also mentioned previously, this about the know-how that this market, because they're using European standards and systems, is really explicitly needing know-how from Europe and people with experience installing and maintaining and designing these systems in Europe. So that was another thing we saw was really an advantage for us, both that I personally had worked over in Denmark for 6 years, and also maintaining this connection back to Emsberger and the team there, and being able to draw on their ongoing know-how as well. So that we saw as really an advantage. It's also, as I mentioned, a lot of money going into these projects at the moment. So it is also a market capable of carrying European rates for consultants and for technology. So that was something we also saw was advantageous. And then, of course, these pre-existing personal connections to Australia and familiarity with the culture and the market here. So both myself and Felix have a lot of familiarity. Felix lived over here, I think, for about 10 years, so knows the environment quite well as well. Then just about that first point in the market maturity for our services. So what we really saw here is an opportunity to contribute our services to bridging this gap between what the local know-how that exists so far and the state transport digitalization strategies. So at the moment, there's not, in our perception, enough local know-how to really achieve the high goals that those state transport digitalization strategies have set. So we really saw that as an opportunity to step into the gap and build up the local know-how, as well as contributing ourselves to achieving some of the goals of those strategies. So basically, we're coming in with the goal to help drive this organizational understanding of digitalized railways to achieve the business and service goals with advanced IT, because that's really missing, I think, of that understanding of how they really can use these systems to achieve the goals that are set out in these digitalization strategies. So that sort of falls into 5 general categories. So business, process, and technical solutions. So helping with conceptual business and technical guidance to link the engineering of these systems with the business success. So that could be, for example, design and development of business roles and processes, TMS or HHT functionality, user interfaces, topology databases, system tuning and maintenance, those sorts of things. So linking business, technical, and business success and some of the goals of these digitalization strategies. The next one is business readiness. So a lot about strategy and communication guidance to maximize the effectiveness of their test and business readiness activities. So particularly through our experience with being involved with the process testing in Denmark, that gave us a lot of insight into how to use testing as a good tool to bring a lot of different teams together. So testing, training, operational rules, using it as a way to bring end users in and build enthusiasm and knowledge of these new systems, and to really encourage collaboration and information sharing amongst teams. The next one is around business transformation. So actually fundamentally transforming the business goals, processes, and ways of thinking to take advantage of these new systems, because there's not really that understanding of what these systems can do. They don't even realize what they could do with them in terms of meeting the goals of these transport digitalization strategies, and particularly the service and capacity and customer focus that some of these strategies and also intermodal transport as well, that some of these strategies really outline. Systems engineering, so bit more typical engineering services around requirements and system integration, TMS and HHT, how to manage contracts with big suppliers with these sorts of projects, and rollout scheduling, etc. And then finally, the last one is this about linking the local and overseas talent. So this link between Binary and M. Burger we see as really important. That link where we can draw on a big team that has experience in a lot of different areas and bring really up-to-date knowledge into the programs here and use that as a way to build up the local knowledge base, we think is really something that can contribute to the market here. So just going through the opportunities that we saw, obviously I've mentioned this about helping to drive the achievement of these wider digitalization strategies that some of the states have. There we see really, building up this local know-how and resource base and expanding Binary into a company that has both experience in the local market and still that link back to Europe and the ongoing projects there and the developing knowledge and experience. We also really would like to explore the potential of kind of creating a transformation know-how hub. So this we see as really key here to get the benefits of these these digital systems and achieving the digitalization strategies of really helping these businesses transform and understand the full scope of opportunities that these systems present to provide better services. And that we think could then be exported elsewhere, even back into M. Burger and some of the clients that they have there and the projects in Europe, and to really, we see it as an opportunity to kind of build a hub of know-how around transformation. Some of the challenges we've faced, and I think this is maybe the diagram that Masha mentioned earlier about the scope of the rail network in Australia. Obviously, it's very centered around the big cities, but we do have a massive amount of line all throughout the country from east to west and north to south that, I guess gets us up to that 33,000 kilometers. But just going back to the challenges, one of the big ones we found is around the insurance costs. That over here we have found that the insurance industry assigns a bit the wrong risk profile, particularly around these professional engineering services. We found that they often, so I want to put us into a construction type profile, which pushes up the insurance premiums significantly. So that's something that we're still working on the best way to overcome. The contracting that particularly the state governments do tends to focus just on standard services, standard engineering and construction services, but this digitalization, in our experience, requires a bit new approaches to this contracting. And they don't really have much experience with that here, of looking at, for example, business transformation and business readiness being done in a slightly different way to historically how it's been handled. And that feeds a little bit into the final one there about the rail industry here, as elsewhere, is quite novice to this digitalization and the impacts on the industry as a whole. So they're looking for very low-level services where digitalization is perceived primarily as just an update of technology and its maintenance processes, rather than shifting that focus towards how the rail industry produces and manages transport services. So a much higher level thinking in order to really optimize the outcomes of these digital systems to meet these digitalization strategies that the state governments and also the federal government, it seems, have set up as well. So I think that's it from me. So thank you very much. Back to you, Masha.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic, and I think very valuable, practical insights from somebody who's in that industry. Next, we're going to hear from Steve Johnson. So if you can unmute and share your slides, please, Steve, from Matesa. Thank you. I think you're still on mute, Steve.
Thank you. All good.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
there we go. Yep.
Hi, I'm Steve Johnston. So I'm looking after Matesa Australia and the market entry. Just before we get in, it's quite interesting, similar story around the connection and why I'm particularly doing this. So I was experienced with Matesa from the UK and came out to Australia quite a while ago. And then I approached Matesa directly about the idea of setting up a business in Australia. So it's interesting that there's a common theme in how these companies have come to be. Anyway, I'm going to explain a little bit more about Matesa. So Matesa is based in Crissier near Lausanne, founded in 1945. The business has a worldwide presence. Based, the newest entity is Australia, the subsidiary I'm leading, but we have quite a long history, obviously, across Europe, into Japan as well, and Brazil. So quite a large spread internationally. And just to give a bit of context of what we do, Matesa makes big yellow toys for looking after the rail infrastructure. So it's heavy engineering, it's Swiss manufacturing, trying to leverage that Swiss product into Australia, and provide the quality transfer for the networks here in Australia. I think this has been said a few times now. So the railway in Australia is very big. We have a slightly different map. There's many of these maps around. And a bit of a European heritage in some respects. So with the signalling that was just mentioned, there's been a big move towards adopting current European standards. But historically, the railways in Australia have been a complete mix of different technologies from different countries. We have different gauges, as was mentioned earlier. We've got 3 different gauges. 1067, 1435, and 1600 for the track gauge. But even worse than that, we have 10 or 20 different vehicle outlines. So from the perspective of interoperability of rolling stock, for instance, it's an absolute nightmare, which is a very important factor for us in the field of machine supply, but also from a rolling stock supply perspective, has a massive impact on what the complexity of trying to find common standards or supply that suits different networks. There also is a lot of influence from the US. So a lot of the heavy railways in Australia rely very heavily on the United States standards, the AREMA standards for railway. So that brings another level of complexity to the situation. One of the other reasons that Matesa came into Australia, not just because I was here, but because there's lots of ex-UK and ex-European people in Australia. They knew the Matesa product, and so they were interested to find out more about Matesa in Australia and encourage the business in. And that led to the sale of machines into the mining sector before I started. And now we've got further machines arriving. But interestingly, all the equipment that's going to be in Australia has been bought by British guys working for Australian companies. So it demonstrates the strong links from the history of people's knowledge of the brands and so on. This is a pretty important slide, and if you come to any of the Australian conferences and so on, you'll see this slide shown a lot. This wave of work, or the tidal wave of work, is how it looked in 2017, which was a big forecast forward to 2024, sitting at just under 7 billion. By the time we get to 2018, that's reached 7 billion and just pushed over 7 billion as a forecast. And in 2021, that same peak has now raised to 10 or 11 billion dollars. And this is just for major rail projects, which are valued at over $2 billion each. So this project wave, this huge volume of work is continuing to grow and is continuing to get wider. So it pushes out further into the future. So I think this is a very clear sign that the work that's coming and we've been talking about this evening is very real. These are all funded projects. This isn't concepts, or these aren't ideas. These are things that are actually happening right now. And there's a lot of other projects that are still in the pipeline being designed and developed. So we're seeing new build for interstate, we're seeing metro in every major city, and we're seeing another wave of heavy haul expansion potentially coming quite soon into the mining sector. So also there's a bit of realism here about what to expect. It takes time, a lot of time, to build a network of contacts and build credibility. If you can acquire a local company, that can obviously help. We're currently doing quite a bit of advertising to try and push the Matesa brand and position ourselves for future work. The time then equals money. There's a significant cost to entering a new market, and especially traveling in Australia. The distances are quite vast and the time taken is quite huge. So we've got a recent example of guys coming over in a few weeks for the Ausrail this year, and his expectation was that we could just quickly travel from Sydney to Brisbane, not realizing that that's a 1,000-kilometer trip to get there. So people need to understand the size of the country and the time and money it takes to travel around. The resources are extremely limited in Australia, especially in the rail sector. As you've seen, bringing in European knowledge for various projects, whether it's tunnelling, whether it's signalling, track construction, it's a very big restraint on resources right now. And COVID has only just made that situation worse. There seems to be a bit of a slowdown in interest in people moving to Australia, which is continuing. So that's going to pose a big problem for new companies coming in. For us, being seen as being local was a huge challenge, and was the reason we've opened a workshop in Western Sydney, really demonstrating that we're here and that we're going to be able to service them in the longer term. Localization is a big issue. It's been a huge issue for Matesa. Selling a Swiss product in Australia without modification is very, very challenging. I think there needs to be respect for the need to localize or Australianize the product to suit the market. And you're going to need a lot of support from other people. You can't do this alone. You need advisors, you need lobbyists, you need people to open doors, you need to get the contacts, and that takes a lot of time and effort. So some of the challenges that we've faced back to head office is that the head office needs to understand the market as well, and this takes a lot of time and a lot of energy for the subsidiary, but it takes a lot of time for the head office. If you're committed to the market, you really have to be committed to the market, and that means that people need to travel, they need to come and see the market, they need to understand what's going on. There needs to be investment for the long term. That this takes time to build the networks and to understand. And I've said communication. This is a two-way thing. Managing the internal and sustaining the energy for the project of being in a country like Australia, especially when it's so far away and the time zone is very challenging. It's now 8:15 at night, and that starts to be pretty tiring for everybody. And then obviously people understanding the real size of the opportunity in Australia, it's a long way away. And unless people come and visit on a regular basis and really touch and feel the market, it's actually quite challenging to convince everybody that the opportunity is as big as you assert it is. But with a lot of effort, the opportunity can be quite huge. So we're seeing a very significant pipeline of opportunities. It's not work that's won, but it's very significant pipeline of opportunities, and it's the opportunity is going to keep growing. Another issue is or factor is that Australia is a new country. And this is a bit of a strange concept to a lot of Europeans, but the infrastructure is still being built. The lifeline and the arteries of service in the country, they're not all in place. So there's huge volumes of opportunity for building that. It's certainly not too late to come and invest and make an effort, because the ongoing opportunity is huge, and it's a great country to live in. So nobody's really mentioned that. Quality of life in Australia is great. The space, the environment, the nature, it's very different to Switzerland, but it's also a very, very nice place to be. But it all takes a lot of time and a huge amount of effort. So be realistic about your timeframes. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I actually dropped out of the call for a moment there, but I came back in on my mobile, so hopefully that's all good. Thank you very much. I think it's really important that you have also put a little bit of a reality check on the end of that. I know that, we all think that it's beautiful and lovely here and everybody should come here, and don't understand why they don't. But obviously, yes, the understanding between the head office has to be there as well. So we've come to the end of the official presentation. So now I'd really like to open the floor to some questions. If there are any, you can either unmute yourself and put your camera on, or you can type it in the chat. Now I'm going to try and log in on my computer again, because it's a little bit easier to manage that process. So I'll just see if I can log back in again. But if there's any questions in the meantime, feel free to put your hand up or just unmute yourself. Or is everybody going to be really shy?
Okay, Masha, I will do, I will then start. I have one question. Thank you very much. I will then also probably try to summarize at the very end. But let's say you said, especially on the rolling stock, I'm a little bit interested, because there were some changes from Alstom taking over Bombardier, and we had this EDI, we had different kind of system integrators. Mitsubishi was over there. What's the situation actually at the moment in respect to rolling stock system integrators? Can somebody explain that a little bit?
Steve, you want to have a look at that one?
You're going to throw that to me. So when you say rolling stock system integrators, you're trying to describe the builders of rolling stock, or is that your? Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, just so that you know the question, we have a lot of Swiss rail companies, and not only as a complete system provider, but as well product delivers. And I know a lot doing business to Australia on a very product level, and that's why I'm asking this question.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert in rolling stock generally, but I am an industry nerd, so I kind of have an industry level of understanding. We have an Australian domestic producer, or two. We have Downer and UGL. Downer has had a big partnership with one of the Chinese manufacturers out of Zhejiang, I think. And there's been a huge delivery of rolling stock into Sydney from that partnership. Then there's UGL, who also has operations maintenance and construction of rolling stock for Sydney mainly again. And then we have the partnership, or the Bombardier Alstom conglomeration, which predominantly was a bit of a fight down in Melbourne between the two companies, and then each company had different establishments in Brisbane and in Perth. But now that they're one entity, they actually dominate the market very heavily here, with new rolling stock, huge orders into Perth, big rolling stock orders into Brisbane, and refurbishment as well, and ongoing supply into Melbourne. And then they're supplied into South Australia as well. But those are the three players that are really now present in Australia. There's been a huge amount of pressure on Downer, or sorry, I'll rephrase that. There's been a huge amount of pressure on the New South Wales government to bring future manufacturing of rolling stock back into Australia. With Downer having a facility in Newcastle, and UGL being present here in New South Wales as well, I would be very confident that future orders will go to UGL or Downer. We've seen recent rolling stock for Alstom coming from India, for instance, for the metro in Sydney. But there's a growing pressure and a growing sense that we want to manufacture that back in Australia. That would be my overview. So yes, there should be greater opportunities with those companies for Swiss suppliers. But the envelope is very small. This is it's almost a British railway in some respects, which is quite unbelievable. And I think various companies have struggled to manage that situation. We have Korean trains as well arriving in Sydney now. So everything in Sydney's been outsourced, basically.
Yeah, and they have been. I think. Thank you very much.
I think from what I think, Steve, I sort of concur with that. It is a small envelope, as you say, and I guess when we put the report together, I think probably the primary opportunity we saw perhaps at this stage was, again, as Steve has alluded to, in terms of partnerships, so supply partnerships. So I think it would be very difficult to dislodge those specific players that are well entrenched in Australia. But is there opportunities to partner to provide, as we've said in the report many times, improved technologies, that deliver maybe maintenance reductions in terms of cost, maybe increased passenger comforts. I mean, there was a particular example we came across in terms of carriage design, where they're looking for, things as basic, if you like, as kitchen facilities within the carriage. So things that make it very simple for passenger comfort. So high tech, but delivering passenger amenity, greater amenity and comfort. So that's just one example of many that we've found in terms of potential supply partnerships, as Steve has alluded to.
So we've got a couple of questions rolling in, and maybe if you just stay online, Phil, at the moment, because you might be able to say something to that. There's a question about the local content, and obviously that's a very important thing always in Australia. And going forward, I think with this new strategy that I was mentioning in my initial introduction, the National Road Procurement and Manufacturing Strategy is going to focus on local content. Do you, Phil, or Steve, or even Sonia, is there a particular percentage, or does it really matter? Is there a percentage of that, or is it just a part of the contract and it varies each time?
Steve, correct me, and Sonia, correct me if I'm wrong, but my take on that is currently there isn't any set national percentages of local supply. I think each state and territory has its own regulations and requirements around that. But I do understand that from a federal level, there is being some sort of policy development around local content. So that will go across the states as opposed to each of the states and territories having their own requirements. Is that something you both concur with?
Sorry, you go.
No, Sonia, go. You go.
No, I was just going to say the only thing I would add to that is about the union situation here. I think in terms of supply of infrastructure and such, that's absolutely the case. But I do know they've had some problems here with, for example, maintenance contracts and such things that outsourcing of that can lead to problems with unions and that sort of thing. So I think it depends a little bit on the particular type of service you're talking about there.
I was just going to add that the ARA, the Australasian Railway Association, which is kind of the body that was mentioned earlier by Marsha, they are running currently a process to try and harmonise local content arrangements and terms and so on for contracts, because each at the moment it really is a state by state, contract by contract situation. It's very confusing and difficult to then prove that you actually comply with certain rules or so on, because it's different every single time.
Maybe I can say something about that. There's also a lot of common sense in this in the Australian market, in the sense that if you look at the world from the Australian perspective, it's a relatively small population sitting on a relatively large rock, very, very far away, taking that situation empathically into account in your business behavior, I think, is key, almost more than the formal requirements. So if you can tell a story whereby you give the Aussie battler a go in all of this, then you're always better off than saying we're going to bring the best product from overseas that's going to roll over the Australian market now.
Thank you. There's another question from, sorry, Bob, did you say something?
I was also going to say that the state governments vying with each other for different local contents is an issue, but the state premiers don't like other state premiers getting one up on them as to, we're going to build a train in New South Wales, or rather than the trains rather than the train being built in Queensland. So there is a competitive nature between the states as well, which is good on one hand.
Thank you. Then there's a question from Roland Van Hart. Australia tend to use European standards, Ian, or the ISO, or do they create their own? I presume that is talking generally, so rolling stock and or signalling. Not sure, Roland, but maybe if you can say something to that, Steve. Have you had problems with certification at all?
Yes. This is actually a very painful process. At some base level, the European norms or ISO standards are in one sense it should be quite easy, but actually when it comes down to state by state requirements, do not. So each railway or each state then imposes their own requirements, which may be slightly different again. So that can be very, very challenging especially to articulate that problem back to the Swiss, where the core engineering is being done. That's a big challenge. That makes sense.
Sonia, have you found that also, or is it less relevant in signalling?
I found it less relevant in signalling so far. Basically around the ETCS and the TMS parts, I haven't experienced that problem, no.
Okay. Then we've got the next question is from Christoph Kier. Is it a fact that Australia intends to introduce ATC system instead of ATCS? A means Australia. I think that is also for Sonia. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was just having to think about that. I think so my experience on the digital systems program so far, based here in Sydney, is that ATCS is being thrown around, but so the main goal is to convert as much as possible to ETCS, but they are building in sort of a backdoor provisions for ATCS integration with ETCS and the TMS systems, I think based mostly on the costs for the rolling stock and the rolling stock providers. So there is talk of that and building it in as sort of an add-on, but ETCS is seen as the core of the systems.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we've got another question here from Ko Yin, thanking us for the presentation, and then asking, is there some more information on the infrastructure ownership? Who are the biggest network infrastructure owners of the 33,000 kilometre network? Any ideas how they manage, maintain, renew their existing objects, or do they plan to maintain their upcoming infrastructure? Maybe Phil, you can say to that. We may have lost Phil. I know my internet.
Well, I could.
Good. Okay, Bob. Thank you.
Look, the it is run. The states own a certain amount of the networks in their cities, and then there's a federal rail that looks after interstate trains. I don't have a breakup at hand of what percentage of rail is owned by the states and what percentage is owned by the federal track company. We could get that and post it as a as an add-on, because I think that is important.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that, Bob. Then, is there a plan of the Australian to the cycle time of passenger train operations like in Switzerland? That question was from Patrick Sigrist. I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question. If you don't mind unmuting Patrick. And just maybe...
You hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you very much. Didn't find the correct word at the moment. It means mainly, is there any plan to have an interval timetable that is running on in the passenger operation in Australia, maybe nationwide or state or per state?
So Stephen Johnson is shaking his head. Stephen, who obviously has an opinion on that and a knowledge base. If you don't mind unmuting, Steve.
I don't have any hard evidence. We don't really have a national rail network from a passenger perspective. This is a concept that's actually quite hard for a lot of Swiss and European people to get. So traveling between the capital cities by train is somewhere close to impossible. It is totally impractical and extremely slow and very infrequent. Then the level of service within Sydney metropolitan area, for instance, or Brisbane or Melbourne, is actually very good. And we certainly don't have clock face kind of timetables, and we don't have trains that are timetabled to meet other services to the same level that you Swiss have achieved. But yes, in Sydney, the trains go at a certain time past the hour, and if you turn up at the station at that time, in certain stations, they will always leave at the same interval. so that works quite nicely. But that's a bit of a rarity, and that's been a recent introduction. The Sydney Metropolitan Network, for instance, is almost a case of just push as many trains through the system as possible. That's my expectation and understanding, but Sonia's probably got more of an insight into the operational aspect. But from a national perspective, there is no national train network in that sense. There's occasional trains between cities.
I can maybe put that into perspective. If you look at it from a Swiss perspective, if you take the Sydney metropolitan area, you have an area which in size and population is similar to Switzerland. If you take the city metropolitan rail network, you have 1,000 kilometers of line roughly, which is, however, extremely densely traveled, meaning that on that 1,000 kilometer of rail, you have, of rail lines, not rail track, but rail lines, you have the same number of passengers as the whole of Switzerland every day. So when we're saying, no, there isn't clock face timetabling or anything like that over Australia, yes, of course there isn't, because then after the Sydney metropolitan area, you've got 1,000 kilometers of nothing until something else happens in any direction, at least. So you have one night train a day that bridges that gap, which is fun for tourists and kids, but that's roughly where it ends. But then you enter another area like Melbourne and Brisbane, which has a similar, not quite the size of Sydney, but similar type networks, which in and of themselves are suburban in nature and have regular timetabling. And what's also true, what Stephen said is there is a very, very heavy peak imbalance in those networks because it's mainly used for commuting. They are not so well used for other trip purposes on average, certainly not compared to Switzerland. And that means there's a huge peak bias in the demand, and that means at peak hour the timetable is such that you can maximize the number of trains you get to every platform at the downtown area that you somehow can manage to. That's it. Nothing else matters, basically. I think that sums it up.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask another question? It also goes to the scheduling. Is there in the, as an example, Sydney greater area, is there a connection ensuring or Anschlusssicherung auf Deutsch, connection ensuring system, or is it then when I have go? Do I know when I have to take the next train from the current train or something like that?
The idea in scheduling in Australia is to avoid connections. Okay. It's the Anglo-Saxon ideology that it's impossible to guarantee them, and people don't want them anyway. Therefore, we don't do them, and they'd rather have a rolling stock run around inefficiently than making timed connections and trying to manage them. However, the Sydney network, in terms of its layout, at least partially lends itself to that, to doing that, and with the introduction of the Siemens product range, the Swiss Siemens product range, in terms of traffic management in Sydney, they're actually getting that functionality by default.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe if Sonia and Felix can have a look at this last question that's here. What regulations are in place regarding certification and verification of applied standards in terms of products and systems? Is that something that you are able to answer?
I wouldn't say I know much about that topic. I'm not sure, Felix, if you have a comment.
No, it's not the big question for me. No. So I mean, it's the famous EN51 blah blah stuff, isn't it?
Exactly. I was referring to that. So what organizations do you have in place to ensure that you get what you order, for instance?
Steve, are you able to make a comment to that, or do I need to take that away as a?
Yeah, not really. That's
Okay. I mean, my personal experience is that if there isn't an Australian standard that is probably copied either from the US or Europe, then they will just use the European one in practice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay,
Uh,
thanks.
Any other questions?
If I could just speak in favour of the Sydney train network, it is actually a very good system. It, as someone said, it takes the whole population of Switzerland round Sydney each day. I don't know what they do in Melbourne, but I can certainly say the Sydney train system has really improved over the last 5 years or so. Much cleaner, much safer.
Thank you, Bob, for that. Anybody else have any other questions that you'd like to ask now? Or, we're always available to send the questions to us in writing and answer them later if you don't feel comfortable in this forum.
Maybe I could ask one more question. I was wondering, you mentioned that they're investing 155 billion in the next 15 years to construct new lines. It would be nice to have a little bit more view onto where and how many kilometers are they actually planning on building in the coming time.
Yep.
So like how much percentage is the network gonna extend to? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Phil, would you
I
like to?
think
Yeah, I think again, there is some detail of that specific question in the report, and specifically we cover off things like which types of projects are going ahead. We describe what those types of projects are, which most of them are at the announcement stage, so opportunities that yet are to be realized. But that type of information certainly is contained in the report. So yes, if you'd like to download that and have a look through, you'll see it in one of the sections clearly stated out there in a table format.
I'm sorry, which report are you referring to?
So the report that was written by Strategy Australia, so by Phil, who was just speaking with you, and Bob, will be posted for the Israel members, and it will also be available on the Switzerland Global Enterprise Go Global cockpit for download. So once the webinar has concluded, I'm not sure whether it'll be immediate or maybe tomorrow or in the coming days, there will be the availability of that report where you'll get further details. And if you have questions still, we'd be more than happy to answer those.
Yep.
Come back to us and we can answer those bilaterally.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you very much.
No problem. I have a few more questions that I have lined up here if nobody has one. Maybe just quickly to Phil, just in terms of decarbonisation, because we did talk about that, and I think that is quite an important subject with the Swiss government having a real directive into sustainability of everything. Could you just maybe make a comment on the impact of decarbonisation having in the rail sector in Australia, Phil?
Yeah, as I alluded to, Marcia, in the earlier presentation that we did, obviously around 18% of emissions are from that transport sector. And again, as I said, 85% of that really is attributable to road transport. So one of the key focuses that really, I guess, highlights is that in saving, in reducing CO2 emissions, if there's a modal shift, a transport modal shift from road to rail, well, clearly that will, between 85% road, 18% of Australia's total CO2 emissions, it becomes very clear as a clear strategy that if they shifted that modal from currently road to rail, which is going to be a big ask because we have very well developed road systems here. We have all of the infrastructure in place. So will it shift entirely? No, we don't think so. But will the mix change? Yes, it will. And I think on top of that, I think it's been driven technologies. So they're seeing that how will that decarbonisation realize? How will we realize a quantifiable reduction in energy emissions? And that is, what the government, this is not hearsay, this is what the government have mapped out in a plan, that it will be attributable in part, in a large part, to new technologies, products, etc., that demonstrably reduce or lessen emissions. So again, that's why we've said in the report that we believe this energy and propulsion sector is going to be very important in the future as we work towards 2050 carbon neutrality. But closer to home, 2030, we're expecting to deliver half of that particular target. So it's not such a long-term opportunity. There's now an emerging opportunity for new products and technologies that show, as I've said, demonstrable reductions in carbon emissions in that rail sector. So that's what we believe, is going to happen now, and that's what we believe are some clear opportunities for Swiss rail companies who are experts in that area to start to build partnerships with the key players here. Again, they're identified in some of in the report that we've identified, and start that process. But I think if it's demonstrable, if we can show it, if we can demonstrate it, I think they'll be adopted fairly broadly across the rail network.
Thank you very much. I think that's probably a good spot for us to wrap it up. What do you think, Andreas?
Yeah. Yes, probably. Yeah, please go ahead. I will round up at the end.
So unless there's any more questions, as I said, there's 3 different offices, the French, the German and the Italian part of Switzerland, where you can contact Switzerland Global Enterprise or the TradePoint Australia. Just remember the time difference because I won't be at this time of the night usually. But we'd be happy to get back to you with any questions that you have once you've read the report as well. And as Andreas was saying, we'd be to develop this further and really look at, helping the companies that want to come here. I'll pass over the word to you, Andreas.
Yes, thank you very much, Masha. I mean, just from a content point of view, just some points. I mean, we were talking about the model shift, and I think I want to share with you that we also in Switzerland have our goals, of course. I mean, we are 99% electrified. This is a little bit an easier task. However, we want to bring regional, especially in the region, people using public transport system. And we are doing a lot of workshops at the moment. Please, I think we should stay in contact from Switzerland to Australia, because I think we have the same goals, and we should work together on that, what we do, and we will share that, of course. I heard a lot of trends, digitalization. We talked about decarbonization. You have autonomous driving. I think there's a lot of trends we have in common. I think let's going on that. I have one comment, especially in these goals, and I heard about ETCS and all those things. I mean, important is to have clear goals set up and defined, because there's a long migration path always in railways. We have to protect our investments, and I think whatever is need to be done, we need to have a certain narrative of how you spend money, in which direction you spend money. And I understand this ETCS thing, which we also have in Switzerland. By the way, also there we can share our view. In Europe, it's a huge challenge. We heard about interoperability in Australia. You can imagine in Switzerland, which each and every country has its own signaling system and whatever. And I think there, let's also exchange further. I think for us, it's a starting point because we also are used of high complexity. Yeah, I think at the end, somebody said communication. Yeah, stay in contact. I think that's easy with you in Australia. of course. We from Swiss Rail can coordinate that for our members. I mean, it's our task and to bring the right question to the right person. We will step further with finding partnership. We heard about partnership is not so easy. In the past, it was more like people love to be in Australia, and then they made the business there. I heard that a couple of times. I think it's a fantastic country anyway. And in this respect, thank you for all the specialists, the presentations in the evening, I'm sorry, where you could spend time. You don't spend time with your family, you spend time with Swiss industry training and insight. And for that, I want to thank you very, very much.